There we go. And yeah, Daniel chapter 8. You guys see that, right?
Did you say NIV version?
I am using the ESV version, but
Yeah.
whatever version you have is okay.
I'm pulling that on the computer instead of looking
Yeah,
at myself.
English Standard Version is, and there was no real particular reason. It's just that's kind of like what I ended up using.
Yep.
But Daniel 8 we have, and this is going to be it's actually the second vision that Daniel himself sees. There is a dream by Nebuchadnezzar. And this one is going to involve a ram and a goat. One side over here to our right is going to be the east, which is going to be the rise of the Persian and Median Empire, the Persians and the Mede. And then as they become great, then Greece in the west is becoming great. And you have this this goat with with one prominent horn in the middle, which is going to represent Alexander the Great, and he is, of course, the one who's going to make the Grecian Empire great. But then this horn is going to be broken off, which is, of course, Alexander the Great is going to die. But in his place, there's going to be 4 generals that that take his place. So we've gone through a little bit of the historical part of it. Of course, if you remember, in previous visions, we were dealing with 4 empires, starting with the Babylonian Empire, then going into the Persian and the Persians and the Medes, that empire, then going into the Grecian Empire, and then going into the Roman Empire. And there's and of course, there's some prophecies that are, there's a key prophecy there that happens in the Roman Empire involving the coming of the Son of Man. So just to kind of recap an intro, like where we're at, both Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, then their visions focus mainly on 2 periods of history. So they focus in the Greek Empire and the Roman empires. Of course, in Daniel's day, this had not come yet, but he's seeing it already, like in dreams and visions for the future. And so it brings us basically, these visions bring us to 2 key events. The first one is one that we're actually going to discuss today a little bit more, and it's the events caused by Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes is part of the Greek Empire. He's a general and a leader who ends up ruling in the area of Jerusalem, and he brings about the destruction of the temple. He attacks a bunch of the people in the city, and he actually crucifies a lot of them. He slaughters a pig on the altar and causes what we would call the abomination that causes desolation. So that happens in the Greek Empire days. And then the second event would be during the Roman Empire, and that's the coming of the Son of Man. And that there is somebody who we call the beast, the 4th beast, which kind of defied description. But during that time, of course, Jesus identifies himself as the Son of Man. And the way that Jesus uses the Son of Man language and the things that he's predicting from it, or telling you what's going to happen, become associated for him with the physical destruction of the temple in shortly after his ascension, which happens in 70 AD. So a lot of people deliberate about what's going to happen in the future, and I do believe, of course, that there is a physical fulfillment in some of these prophecies, I see it as an already but not yet sort of thing. So in other words, these two things have happened, but they are pointers to something that would happen later on in the future with the character who we call the Antichrist, right? But instead of speculating that much about that, I've decided in this Bible study to kind of focus more on the things that did happen and the way that Jesus utilized the Son of Man language and his prophecies for the generation that he was talking to. So these events are both connected, as we've seen. You know, they both resulted in the temple being destroyed. And I should point out in the last Bible study, I pointed out that the Son of Man event in chapter 7 in Daniel is Jesus uses that as a warning against the Jewish leadership. So, you know, when he's in front of the Sanhedrin, he tells them, from now on, you will see the Son of Man lifted up and riding on the clouds of glory and being seated on the right hand of the Father. And he's telling this to a crowd that's just about to persecute him and then kill him. So, so I should say prosecute him and then kill him. So I've kind of used this example before, that if I say to you, you know, Luke, I am your father. First of all, I'm kind of you know that I am not identifying as Darth Vader, but I'm also calling you Luke Skywalker, right? So by saying, you know, that I am the Son of Man and you're about to kill me, well, what does that make you? If you know the prophecy in Daniel 7, he would put them in the same category as the beast that goes after God's people. And the whole, not just Roman machinery, but the Jerusalem system goes after the Christian. They become the original persecutors, including Paul himself, of the early Christian church, you know. So Jesus is saying, you know, Jerusalem, you know, woe to you, Jerusalem, and your house is left to you desolate. And he replays a moment, a key moment in Ezekiel's vision, where Ezekiel, you remember, he's in the temple himself, or he sees the temple, I should say. He sees a vision of God's presence leaving the temple, going out of the eastern gate, across the Kidron Valley, and sitting on the Mount of Olives before going on to Babylon and into exile, where Jesus, he makes his way into Jerusalem and he leaves the temple. He does the same thing, leaves out the eastern gate, crosses the Kidron Valley, sits on the Mount of Olives, and tells his disciple, not one stone's going to be left on top of the other, and saying, you know, this is the destruction of the temple. And of course, Jesus is the presence of God, and he's going to be with his own disciples, even if that means being with them in exile. So he makes several predictions, you know, about the temple, and a number of indicators that, you know, this is all part of it. And one of the things that you know, the book of Hebrews kind of points out, which is written before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70, is that it kind of has to happen because the old covenant is passing away and the new covenant has taken place. The temple is now going to be made out of human stones, that Christ is going to build his house, and the very cornerstone of that temple, the spiritual temple, was the stone that the builders rejected. And he's building the new temple with stones not cut by human hands, but a spiritual body of living stones, which is us. And And that's where Jesus went with all of these prophecies that were spoken of in Daniel. So the other thing that I want to point out here is that as we'll see, the desolation of the temple by cousin Antiochus Epiphanes and the desolation of the temple or destruction of the temple in AD 70 were because of transgression. Then, in other words, it was because of judgment. Anytime the temple was destroyed, whether it was the first time or if it was the under Antiochus Epiphanes or under the Romans, it was connected to at least bad leadership in Israel. There's always been a remnant, and Daniel was part of that remnant. And the temple gets restored or replaced on behalf of the remnant. So I put here in my notes, it says, in short, Israel's exile and destruction of the temple, including Daniel's, is because of transgression. But the replacement or restoration of the temple is on behalf of the remnant. I know that's a mouthful, but we've gone through quite a bit up to this point. So I'm going to bring us back to the even bigger story, which is kind of how you can see Daniel in the context of the entire Bible. So if you because Daniel is all about transfer of power, right? And transfer of power, or just saying that even though Babylon is in control right now on earth, who is really in control is God. God is always in control. All of these empires that have come and gone would not be there unless God allowed it, because he'll put in who he wants and he'll take out who he wants. And so God is sovereign. But whether you're talking about the transfer of power from the Sanhedrin and the priest of that day and the kingdom being given to another people, which are, those on the highways and byways. And Jesus had a lot of parables about that kind of stuff. Or whether you're talking about the kingdoms of men, or you're talking about the kingdoms of the spiritual realm, the demonic realm, there is, it's all in the context of a bigger story in the Bible. So I'll just kind of recap it. And there might be some things that you've heard here before, maybe some things are new, but here we go. So in the beginning, of course, God appoints the Elohim, or the spiritual being, the angels, in other words, to rule the heavens, and then he appoints the humans to rule the earth. But God likes to rule in partnership with his family and his creation. So Genesis 1 through 11 is about the rebellion of both realms, both the human realm and the spiritual realm. We usually concentrate just on Adam and Eve's fall, but for the ancient Jew, they're looking at Genesis 1 through 11 as sort of, it's not just about Adam and Eve and their fall, right? It's there's a progression there, and there's a beginning of a story there, going all the way into chapter 11. So of course we have Adam and Eve's fall, but then there's the progression of evil. Things get worse and worse, spiraling, starting with Cain, who murders his own brother. And then when you get to chapter 6 of Genesis, then you have this strange episode of the sons of God taking human women and as wives, and they produce Nephilim, or and they become Gibborim, which just means mighty men, right? But the word Gibborim there is repeated pretty soon after the flood, when you hear about the next Gibborim who's mentioned is a guy named Nimrod, and Nimrod builds Babylon. So Babylon is one of these places, it becomes an archetype of man and his rebellion against God, or so it's man and his organization against or without God. So Nimrod builds Babylon, and of course in Babylon you have the Tower of Babel, and Babel. It's the Hebrew word is Bavel. It's the same word as Babylon. It doesn't change the word in Hebrew. We change it when we're talking about the Tower of Babel, but it's just the Tower of Babylon. And so man aspires to, to the heavenly rule at Babylon. And what God does is that he scatters them into what we find as 70 nations. Okay. And what he does is that he allots them under the number of the sons of God. He puts them under, it's a little bit like, well, you want to serve these gods who you call gods, these rebel angels, I'll put you under them, and you have the allotment of these nations under these sons of God. I'll show you a couple of verses that refer to this. They're in Deuteronomy. But he puts them under the number of the sons of God, and the nations are temporarily dispossessed. And the rebel gods become the god of the nations, in other words, the demonic realm. But out of this, God decides that he's going to make his own nation. So the next story after the Tower of Babel is that God calls Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, which is in Babylon. And he says, come out of that. I'm going to be your God, and your people are going to be my people, and I will be their God. So he shows Abraham the promised land, but he forges the nation for himself, of course, in Egypt, while they're in exile. And ultimately, we find out that God's plan is to bring the nations back to himself. Abraham would be the father of many nations, not just Israel, and Christ would be the king of those nations. And in fact, Christ's followers are going to rule those nations. So that means that both the spiritual and human authorities would fall to Jesus. All authority is given to him. That's what Jesus means by that, is all authority, all rule, whether it's principalities, powers, dominions in the heavenly places, or whether it's governments on earth, or any of that, are all Christ's. And he is seated at the right hand of the Father until all the nations are made a footstool underneath his feet. But when we say that we're going to rule with Christ, what we're talking about is ruling the nations along with him. In other words, they're taken out of the authority of the demonic realm, and they're put under Christ's feet. This is what the vision with the Son of Man is all about. So Daniel's visions are about the transfer of power from the spiritual and human rulers and the dispossessed nations to the Son of Man and his followers. So I told you I was going to show you a couple verses. First of all, in Deuteronomy, it says, therefore watch yourselves very carefully, since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourselves in the form of any figure. And it goes on in verse 19 to say, and beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the people under the whole heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are this day. One of the reasons I'm bringing these verses up is because when you see this term here, host of heaven, it means the angels, the spiritual realm, or the spiritual rulers, I should say. The sun, moon, and stars are symbolic of them. So even from the beginning, when you see, the sun, moon, and stars kind of language, you have rulership associated with them, heavenly kind of rulership, or just even earthly rulership. So I'll get more into that a bit later, but Daniel uses the symbology a lot in this kind of a language in this chapter. So I want you to get a little bit comfortable with seeing it that way. Of course, Abraham, he's going to see that that Israel is going, or I should say his descendants are going to be like the stars, right? And we think that it means just like the stars in numbers, but it's also that they're going to rule. So that's sort of a theme that develops over time. As if you remember Joseph, he had a vision of the sun and the moon and 12 stars and bowing down to him, or 11 stars. So these are, you see this symbology, like symbolism, I should say, in Revelation. And remember, when I talk about symbolism, I'm not saying it's just symbolism. It's always symbolism about something very real, so I'm not reducing it in any way. So Deuteronomy 32 says something similar. He says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, which was at Babel, right? He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, which would be 70. What's interesting is that in the Masoretic text, they said under the number of the sons of Israel. They changed it. But they were still thinking the number 70, and they're still thinking rulership. Israel, of course, did not exist yet at the Tower of Babel and at the borders, when God fixed the borders of the nations. But it says here in verse 9, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob or Israel is his allotted inheritance, or his heritage. So there's a lot there, but that's kind of like the context in which we can kind of read this story in the context of the bigger story. So let's start finally at verses 1 through 4. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, remember King Belshazzar was the one who was there at the writing of the wall. So we're going back in time a little bit. We've already seen Daniel under the next kingdom, which is, and under under the Medes and the Persians. But we're going back in time while Belshazzar is still king. A vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. This is in Iran. So he is already in, this is Babylonian territory at this time, but it's going to fall to the Medes and Persians. And later on, if you read the book of Esther, she's in the Susa citadel herself. So it's the same place that basically Esther is going to end up quite a time later. And I saw the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. So this is, of course, Media and Persia. Persia, of course, is modern day Iran, but the Medes are modern day Kurds. So the Kurdish people are the former Medes here. And of course, the Persians became much stronger, even though they both ruled together. Of course, Persia became much stronger and still is to this day. So it had 2 horns, the Medes and the Persians, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, which is the Persians, and the higher one came up last. In other words, it was the Medes who were dominant at first, but then Persia became stronger. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. This is actually some ruins of the citadel of Persia, which is still in Iran. And here's kind of an aerial shot of Susa. There's still, parts of the city and It's one of the oldest cities in the world, by the way.
Wow.
And it's over here close to the Persian Gulf. This is where Susa would be. It's in the region of Elam. Of course, here you have Babylonia, and he was in Babylon before then. But just to kind of give you an idea where it is, it's right over here.
Wow.
So it wasn't a stretch to use a ram to represent the Medo-Persian Empire. Amanius or Ammianus, yeah, I don't know how to pronounce it. Marcellinus, a 4th century historian, states that the Persian ruler bore the head of a ram as he stood at the head of his army. And the ram was the national emblem of Persia, a ram being stamped on Persian coins as well as on the headdress of the Persian emperors. So this is kind of a common symbol back in that day. This is David Guzik. By the way, I'm going to use a lot of David Guzik. He's from Calvary Chapel. But I like the way he wrote his notes for this. So I used a lot of his notes, but he's citing Strauss on this. So in other words, the Medo-Persians did not focus eastward. They focused westward. They fought the Scythians to the north and the Greeks to the west and the Egyptians to the south. Verse 5, and I was considering, behold, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. So this is the speed at which the Greek Empire is going to expand, or at least under Alexander the Great. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. That's Alexander. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. So from ancient history, we now know that it wasn't a strange symbol, this goat, right? So the goat was a common representation of the Greek Empire back then. Newton very properly observes that 200 years before the time of Daniel, they were called the goats people. That's from Clark's commentary. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he was cast down to the ground and trampled on him. Keep this in mind, cast down to the ground and trampled on him. We're going to see that again, that same kind of wording. And we're going to see that again in Revelation 12, when the dragon casts the stars down to the ground, right? Doesn't say anything about trampling them there, but those are connected. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. So what happened is that everything outlined here in the red is where Alexander the Great conquered. But after he died, his 4 generals went into competition for control. They didn't exactly work together. They were kind of at war with each other. But you had Seleucus over here, going and see this. Yeah, I mean, this is a big empire, right? It goes all the way to India over here. But Seleucus ruled all the way up to modern day Pakistan, Afghanistan, into Iran and Iraq, up to Turkey. And then down here, Ptolemy was Egypt and part of Libya, and going up into Israel and Lebanon. And then up in the northwest was Lysimachus and Cassander, taking over like parts of Turkey and modern day Greece, that area. So what happened was that Seleucus and Ptolemy were kind of like, there was a lot of fighting kind of like around for this area over here. Now, the Ptolemies were pretty good with Israel, and they kind of, they had a better relationship with them than the Seleucids did. Eventually, the Seleucids would take over Israel, and that's where you're going to get Antiochus Epiphanes, and then you have trouble, right? But early on, the Ptolemies actually had a pretty good relationship with Israel. In fact, the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, was commissioned by Ptolemy because he was building up a library here in Egypt in the what was it, Alexandria, I think it was, the Library of Alexandria, and what he wanted was a copy of all of the Old Testament books to put into the library, and he commissioned some scribes to translate the Bible into Greek. So when you talk about the Septuagint and the way and all the things that the New Testament writers quote from, they are actually quoting from that Greek version. So it was a well-received version of the Old Testament. But as I said, there was some political kind of like back and forth in Israel. Some people thought at one time we should join the Seleucids, and they were pro-Seleucid, and it kind of went back and forth. And then Seleucid, like early on, the Seleucids had kind of a good relationship with the people in Jerusalem, but it was fake. And Antiochus Epiphanes turned on them basically and really attacked them. So from Guzik's notes, he describes kind of the events. They're very complicated. They're very involved. I've read some of it. It's hard to remember all of it, but he gets kind of like the basics of it here. Israel's land was contested between the dynasties of Seleucid and Ptolemy, but the Seleucids gained power over the region in the days of Antiochus III. That's in 198 BC. Antiochus IV gained the throne of his father, Antiochus III, by murdering his brother. So he wasn't the rightful heir to the throne, but he murdered his brother, the former king Seleucid Philopator. And the son of Philopator was the rightful heir to the throne, but Antiochus IV had him held hostage in Rome. Antiochus IV legitimized his rule mainly through flattery and bribery. So he's going around bribing and flattering people, and schmoozing with the high priest in Jerusalem, and getting kind of political control in the area. So then Antiochus IV assumed the title Epiphanes. It means illustrious. It means like shining, right? And alluding to his own deities, thinking of himself as a god, and the ancient Jews twisted his name. Of course, later on, they did this, and they twisted his name into Epimanes, which means madman. So they kind of made a pun out of it. I'm going to say something here about stars, hosts, princes, etc., because we're going to get to a part where it's a little bit difficult to understand. So hosts or stars are symbolically used for angels, but they're also used for rulers and leaders. In other words, kings, priests, etc., and for God's people in general. So this is not just this is common throughout the ancient Near East. First of all, to think of the stars as the gods, or like the heavenly powers, but also to think of kings as stars. So that's why the Magi, they know a king's been born because they see a star, right? Priests are sometimes, or I should say, even in Egyptian understanding, the pious, the holy people, or whatever, or the very pious people, they're seen as stars as well. And so it's kind of a common symbolism here. So in general, it means those who are in ruling space, so seats of authority, whether you're in Eden, heaven, paradise, that sort of thing. But the default, the start of this would be angels, who we think of as angels, the heavenly rulers. But Abraham is promised offspring which would be like the stars, not just in quantity, but also qualitatively, so that that they would rule. Conversely, spiritual hosts, in other words, angels, are also referred to by names that we would associate with human rulers, like they're called princes or rulers, powers, authorities. The book of Jude calls them dignitaries. Of course, princes is where we're going to see Daniel use that in the next chapter when he says that, and Gabriel tells him that he had to fight the prince of Persia, and that later on he had to go fight the prince of Greece, or Javan. So he's talking about spiritual rulers, right? So scriptures don't really make the distinction that we do regarding these seats of authority. For example, the term saints is used in our translations to distinguish human holy ones from angelic holy ones. But in the original languages, they're just called holy ones. And you just have to figure out whether it's talking about angelic holy ones or if it's talking about saints, human holy ones. And sometimes you kind of have to guess. Sometimes it's not even really that clear. So here, when you get to verses 9 through 12, it says, out of one of those four horns, so this is going to be out of the Seleucid horn, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. The glorious land would be Israel, right? It grew, so the little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes. He grows in power, even to the host of heaven. So are we talking about human host, or are we talking of spiritual hosts? And some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on him. Well, we know what Antiochus Epiphanes did is that he killed a bunch of priests and a lot of pious people who would not bow to Zeus and would not renounce their faith in Yahweh. So he threw them to the ground and trampled on them, pious people, and also other rulers, and even rulers in his own, Seleucid empire. So it became great, even as great as the prince of the host. So who's the prince of the host? One commentator, thinks it's Onias, who was the high priest at the time, and he gets replaced by Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes puts Jason, Onias's brother, in his place. The reason being is that Onias was against Hellenism. He did not want Greek influence, and he wanted to keep the Hebrew spiritual life more free from Greek philosophy and thought. But Jason, his brother, was more friendly towards the idea of Hellenization, and so Antiochus Epiphanes got rid of Onias and then put in Jason kind of as a puppet priest, And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. So Onias's temple is overthrown, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. And get this, because of transgression. Whose transgression? It's because of the transgression of the Jewish leadership and just what was going on in Jerusalem at the time, because you had a lot of people who wanted to be more like the Greeks, and they were corrupting the Jewish religious life with Greek philosophy and thought, and becoming more and more secular, I should say. So even in the Old Temple, if you read literature from the Second Temple period, the period like from here all the way to the time of Christ, the commentary that the Jews had on it is that this happened because of corruption within the Jerusalem system. But of course, there were heroes who really stood up and even faced terrible deaths because they would not bow to anybody but Yahweh. Because of transgression, it will throw truth to the ground and will act and prosper. So from Guzig's notes, it says here, Antiochus Epiphanes exerted his dominion toward the south, toward the east, and towards the land of Israel. Antiochus Epiphanes murdered other rulers and persecuted the people of Israel. So he cast some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. Antiochus Epiphanes blasphemed God and commanded idolatrous worship directed towards himself, actually towards Zeus as well, but he exalted himself as high as the prince of the hosts. So he's kind of calling himself almost like a prince of Zeus or something, you know. Antiochus Epiphanes put a stop to temple sacrifices in Jerusalem. And by him, of course, the daily sacrifices were taken away. And then Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple. So the place of his sanctuary was cast down, or the Onias, the priest who was presiding at the time. That's who I think it refers to. Antiochus Epiphanes opposed God and seemed to prosper. He cast truth down to the ground, and he did all of this and prospered. So it cast down, this is from Guzik's notes still. It cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground. And he says kind of the same thing I was pointing out. The host and the stars are symbols in the Old Testament for angels, kings, leaders, and the people of God at large. This prediction was fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes in his attacks against rulers and against God's people in general. The term stars of heaven, you see this in Genesis 12 and 15, and the hosts of the Lord are at times used of God's people in general. So undoubtedly it is the design here to describe pride and the ambition of the little horn, and to show that he did not think anything too exalted for his aspirations, and he trampled on them. Antiochus was an infamous persecutor of the Jewish people. He wanted them to submit to Greek culture and customs, and was more than willing to use murder and violence to compel them. Antiochus' suppression of the Jews came to a head in December of 168 BC, when he returned in defeat from Alexandria. So he'd gone down to Alexandria, Egypt, and he suffered defeat there, and he came back, you know, and he's not in a good mood. He ordered his generals to seize Jerusalem on a Sabbath day, and there he set up an idol of Zeus and desecrated the altar by offering a swine on the altar, and sprinkling the pig's juices in the sanctuary. So sacrifice stopped because the temple was desecrated. I'm going here to Revelation 12, and I'm going to we'll attack the other half of or the last part of Daniel 8 next week, or I should say in several weeks. But Revelation 12, I thought of this when I was reading the throwing down of the host and the stars, and I looked at different commentaries, and actually most of the commentaries that I read recognized the connection between Revelation 12:4 and Daniel 8:10. So here we see, and a great sign appeared in heaven, and a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. So that he was throwing them down. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, she might devour it. I grew up with the idea that this was about Satan before Eden and Adam and Eve and everything, and him tempting the other angels to come and join him in his mischief. It doesn't really make sense to me. And it's really that narrative is just taken from this verse right here. it's not really a narrative that's built up in the rest of scripture. In other words, other scriptures don't really support that that narrative. So when I look at it this way and I connect it to Daniel chapter 8, I'm wondering, and if it doesn't mean that he's attacked, first of all, God's people, because it's talking about this, you know, like in the context of when Jesus was going to be born. And we know that he, you know, he was persecuting Jews. Satan was persecuting Jews and influencing Herod to kill all the young boys in Israel, anybody under the age of 2, and those sorts of things. In fact, Jesus has to run for his life at one point, you know, and go down to Egypt, of all places. So there's some different interpretations of this, but actually I would say the minority would say that this is about the Satan actually drawing a third of the angels along with him to join him. And even the language there is that it's kind of like he's throwing them down. In other words, it's a sign of you know, like he's attacking them. It's not like he's trying to get these stars of heaven to join him, right? So and you know, like I encourage you to look at other commentaries about this, but currently you know, it's kind of like the way that I see it is either that he's attacking God's faithful by doing that, or that there's something going on where he's throwing down political leaders or something. But this is language that's definitely citing Daniel 8:10. Well, I this is a little bit technical, and maybe I'll kind of skip that part. But that's about it. We'll kind of like continue with Daniel 8 the next.
I thought it was all technical.
Yeah. I was like, well, it's getting really technical, but you know.
A lot of
But
stuff,
there's Revelation 12 is I'm getting pieces of it like more and more where like it's making more and more sense to me. And in fact, I think what I'm going to do maybe in a couple of weeks is I'll kind of rest on Daniel and Daniel 8, maybe won't pick up with Daniel 8 until January, but do a thing on the Magi and the time when Jesus was being I would say chased by the dragon, right? It's but really what it is that the Magi come from the east. The Magi come from Iran, and they're and from Persia, I should say, and they were looking for a king. They knew that he was going to be born in Jerusalem. They go there specifically looking for someone born king of the Jews. They know what they're looking for. And the Magi come from the same, they were the same society that Daniel was the head of.
Oh,
Yeah. So when Nebuchadnezzar inherited the wise men from his father, but he didn't trust them. That's why he was ready to kill them if they couldn't tell him what he dreamt.
wow.
And then Daniel saved them. He saved the wise men by correctly interpreting it. And so there are
the people who tried to decipher his dream were the wise men.
Yeah, right.
You know, I mean, I thought there were like some wise people from the city, but I didn't know it's the specific ones that were looking for.
Yeah, they were kind of like they were there to kind of like serve as the emperor's they were kind of like a mix between, say, you know, like governing rulers but also sort of like a priestly role. They would do magic arts, and they try to connect the emperor to the gods, you
Oh,
know, and they would like, they'd be dream interpreters, they were sorcerers.
Mm.
So magi actually means magicians,
oh,
right? That's where we get the word magician from that, right?
oh,
But we also get the word magistrates from that. So that people who are magistrates over a certain thing, they are the same society. After the Babylonians fell, the Persians took them over, and they went into the service for the Medes and the Persian rulers, and so they reappear in Esther. You know, satraps and rulers and everything, but they trace all the way down into the Roman period, and there are stories within villages in southern Iran about Daniel. You know, much long after Daniel. So Daniel was a famous name, and so there's speculation that one of the reasons that these magi understood a little bit of what's going on is because they would have had Daniel's material, and they would have, you know, I mean, he was the head of the wise men, not just under in the Babylonian Empire, but also in the next empire, because he rises to prominence under Cyrus, even, you know. So he was a big deal. But, you know, I always wondered, like, how did they know specifically that this was going to be the king of the Jews that's being born? You know, because they went to the wrong city. They did not go where the star was. They just knew it's over there. They end up in Jerusalem because in their mind, they had to been thinking, well, he must be in Jerusalem. So they go to the king who's in Jerusalem, and who is Herod, but Herod's an Idumean. He's not Jewish at all. And they go, well,
also, God is driving this whole thing anyways
Mhm.
too.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. the whole
I'm sure he
story.
gave him the insinuation where to go or something.
right, yeah.
Mm,
So, you know, like they were, you know, they were, it's both, because like what happens is they find out, they start asking, well, where's the one born king of the Jews? And then Herod doesn't know, he doesn't understand that. So he calls in Pharisees, and the Pharisees, well, you know, he would be born in Bethlehem. So they're like, where's Bethlehem? And they go, but the Pharisees don't go.
yeah.
And so they go down there, and when they get to Bethlehem, then they see the same star appearing over the place where Jesus was born.
Yeah.
So but but in the story there in Matthew, when you see the wise men, when it says wise men, immediately you think Daniel.
Yeah.
You know, immediately you're going, there seems to be a connection here, and what's going on, you know. But I think it's like one of those intriguing but also wonderful stories, you know, of like how God is just saying, you know, that those kingdoms that Daniel was always talking about, and the transferring of those kingdoms, you know, that's about to happen.
Mm,
And they bring a king's ransom. It's not just three guys, you know. They're coming, I think, with they cause an uproar in Jerusalem when they get there.
yeah.
That doesn't happen with just three random, you know, guys. They bring a king's ransom. They're bringing gold, frankincense, and myrrh,
Yeah.
and that's they are honoring a king. They're doing that from a far distant land.
Yeah.
So it's a big deal.
Mm.
Yeah. But anyway, so maybe I'll if I have time, I'm going to do that after the production, because I've got most of the notes from last year about that.
Great.
But sorry, it was a little bit technical, but
No, thank
I
you, Mark.
mean,
the
the
They
whole
said there's going to be all those kingdoms. That's what I mean. You know, a whole lot.
Yeah,
the
it's
whole Old Testament is so technical, like he said.
it is.
I mean, I've read it like 5 or 6 times, and there's still every time I read it, I find things that I don't understand, and
Yeah. I think that like one of the reasons that I take the time and go, okay, the gods being under the nations and like some of the things that I covered in the stars language and host and everything is
Yeah.
because when you see those, then there's a lot of things that seem difficult that aren't so difficult anymore,
Mhm.
or they just make more sense.
Mhm.
In other words, if you put your mind, you have to think like an ancient Near Easterner, somebody in that from 2,000 years and 3,000 years ago, living in that area. How did they see the world?
Yeah.
How did they see the world? And if you take a little time to put your imagination of where they were at and the way they saw things, then it's like, oh, okay, now I can understand this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yep.
Anyway.
Times were different back then. Well, God
Yes.
bless you, Mark, for preparing and doing all this. That's very nice.
That's a lot of information.
Mm,
I got to digest it.
Yeah.
All
That's
right.
really good. That was really good.
Mhm. Maybe it'll be a bigger crowd after Christmas, I guess.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Well, were they starting those classes yet, or?
Or they come for the
Um,
pizza, maybe.
There's a class. Yeah,
I don't know.
like there was a class tonight, and I know some people that were that would have come tomorrow night. But then I know you guys have a meeting tomorrow night, don't you, with the men's
Yeah.
leadership and stuff
Yeah.
like that? So, so it's just tough, and then some people who come, they're actually watching the kids for the school tonight. So it took out a lot of people, but whatever. I'm gonna try to it's hard to figure out a schedule.
Yeah.
But things will smooth out a little bit, at the turn of the year.
Yeah.
So,
My daughter, Mark, works with the kids also in
oh, does she?
the school.
Okay.
Yeah, she works actually. She chose, believe it or not, to work with the baby.